Hi, I'm Shaylee. I'm hosting the Wandering Lattice Quilt Along, and this is kind of a pre-quilt along informational video. We have a couple of quilters who are brand new. This is their first quilt. So I wanted to give them some basic information in case they do not have any previous sewing skills. And if you guys have anything else to add, please throw it in the comments. Let's make them feel super welcome. And I look forward to starting the actual quilt along with you guys on Tuesday.
There are a few important basics when it comes to sewing. First off, when we sew pieces of fabric together, we're placing the right sides of our fabric to one another. So when we're talking about the right sides, we are talking about the side with the print. The wrong side of the fabric is the side that has either a faint print or it's more dull, if that makes sense. So when we're sewing two pieces of fabric together, we want to take the right sides, place them facing one another, and then we're going to sew. That way when we open it up, the seam's on the back side and the pretty part of the fabric is facing us. When we're quilting, we use something called a scant 1/4 inch seam, and you're going to see this in almost every quilt pattern ever. What that means is that we want our seam to be just a little bit under 1/4 inch. This is so that when we open that seam up, that little bit of fabric that kind of folds up is not eating away at how big our block is going to end up being. In really complicated patterns, these small losses can end up leading to blocks that don't fit together, and so that all of the math is wrong all the way across the quilt. If you're still in the learning process of learning how to do your scant 1/4 inch seam, the Wandering Lattice is a really good quilt for you to start on. If you're still in the learning process, you can save a ton of time by chain piecing at each of your steps. This is when you sew all of your pieces in one big long continuous seam without cutting any of the threads. You'll just give yourself a little bit of a thread tail in between each one, so feed it through the sewing machine, sew a little bit past, and then put your next piece in. And if that doesn't make sense, there's tons of videos. I'll probably link one below just so that you get an idea of what that looks like. When we're sewing with layer cakes or 10-inch stackers, there is a pinking edge. That's the little zigzags on the outside. And one of the most common beginner quilter questions is, which part of that is considered the outside of your fabric? And the answer is the little itty bitty points. So if you're ever needing to use the entire 10-inch stacker, try and use the outside of your points when you're cutting. Luckily, with the Wandering Lattice quilt, we're going to end up trimming off most of those pinked edges before we're done with the whole quilt. If I've forgotten anything, you're so confused, or you need more information, feel free to reach out or ask in either our Facebook group or on Instagram. My favorite part about Quilt Alongs is how all of the experienced quilters come in and share their knowledge as well. It's a great place to make friends, and you're going to be, it's fun to sew along with people that you've never met before because everybody's just so nice. So let's talk about prep next. When we talk about quilt prep, there are two major things that come into mind. First is selecting your fabrics and tools, and second is preparing your fabrics and tools. So let's discuss our fabric selection first. This pattern is designed for a pre-cut 10-inch fabric bundle. These are called Layer Cakes by Moda and 10-inch stackers by Riley Blake. I'm not sure about other brands, but they're usually referred to as something similar to those two. They typically contain 42 coordinating pieces of quilter's cotton or flannel from a fabric line. They almost always contain 1 to 2 of each fabric of the fabrics in a fabric line, but sometimes they'll have as many as 3 or 4. Alternatively, you can also use fat quarters, but you'll only get 2 10-inch squares per fat quarter, because fat quarters are typically 18 inches by 22 inches. You will also need 1 cut. You can refer to your pattern for the size, it depends on which quilt you're making, of a fabric that is coordinating but contrasting, which is kind of a weird concept, but let me explain that. You want it to look good with your fabric line, but stand out at the same time. The more it blends or matches, the less obvious your zigzag shapes are going to be. Typically fabric C, which is gray on your pattern, should be a lower volume, meaning little to no print that reads as a solid from a distance, in a neutral color or in a color that is used sparingly in your fabric.
I decided to use a red tone-on-tone fabric for my fabric C because, as you can see, there is a little bit of red in almost all of the prints. However, there are a couple of solid red prints, and so in those areas it kind of fades away a little bit. You don't see the zigzag pattern as well, but there's only 3 10-inch squares, so it's not too big of a deal.
The fabric that's on the front page of the pattern is Poppied and Posies, and it has a lot of white in it, so using the white zigzag, it blended a little bit more and you kind of lost the overall zigzag shape. So here are some examples from my pattern testers to give you an idea of the ridiculous number of options that you have. If you're someone that just really struggles and you are sitting there staring at your layer cake bundle and you have no idea what to do, I highly recommend either choosing white or black, whichever one is not super common in your fabric bundle. Now let's talk tools. This quilt only needs the basics. A large acrylic ruler, at least 10 inches. You're going to want 10 inches on both sides, but it's okay if it's a longer rectangular ruler. A rotary cutter and cutting mat, ironing board, and then I also recommend spray starch or best press as well. As far as prep work, the only thing I really recommend before you get started is starching your fabric. Starching or using best press, which is a starch alternative, gives a stiffness to your fabric and makes your cuts a lot cleaner, your seams neater, and helps reduce stretching and distortion in your fabric, especially when you're working with a bias edge, which is what happens when you cut your fabric diagonally, which, as you can tell, we're going to do a lot of. My first year of quilting, I really didn't think it was going to make that much of a difference, and once I tried it, I never went back. This is heavily starched fabric, and if I tug on it, it does not really stretch. This is a scrap that I did not starch. It's super wrinkly. If I fold it, it does not really come back over, it just flops. And when I tug on it, it stretches a lot. And when it stretches like that, as you apply pressure for cutting, or as you're trying to feed it through your machine, your whole fabric piece is going to end up stretching and get a little wonky, which when all of your blocks end up wonky, you end up with a quilt that's almost globe shaped, which is really not ideal. Now, my personal preference for starching, I use Stafflo and I mix it at a very low ratio. So it's mostly Stafflo with a little bit of water. Then I heavily saturate my fabric and I iron it dry. Some quilters will heavily saturate and then leave it out to dry without pressing. And then some press a very fine mist into their fabric as they're ironing. This is one of those things that I think is a really personal preference. I personally dislike using best press. It just didn't give it as much sturdiness as I like, but a lot of quilters swear by it. I know some hate using starch the way that I do because you'll end up with ugly starchy clumps, especially since I'm ironing it wet. I'll get these white like chunks and everything on the fabric, but because it's starch, it just rinses right out the first wash. Now, if you like to plan out your quilts, this is the time to take your coloring pages and figure out your quilt placement. As you can see, I prefer more of an organic, unplanned look, especially with this particular pattern.